Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It is Sunday, April 27th, 2025. Happy birthday to my best bud, or one of my best buds, Rich. So on this particular Sunday, well, on every Sunday, we look into the purpose and meaning of life. But on this particular Sunday, I have to discuss Pope Francis. Pope Francis died on Easter Monday, April 21st, just this past Monday, at the age of 88. His funeral mass was just held yesterday, April 26th. For those who don't know, the pontiff was born Jorge Mario Bergoglio in Buenos Aires in 1936 to an Italian immigrant family. He joined the Society of Jesus, also known as the Jesuits, in 1958, and then became an ordained Catholic priest, finally in 1969. And then in 2013, he became the 266th Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. And as such, he was the first Jesuit Pope in all of history, as well as the first from the Southern Hemisphere and the first from the Americas in general. He chose to use Francis as his papal name in honor of St. Francis of Assisi. The reason would become quite clear, and probably equally clear why no one had chosen Francis previously. I don't mean that in a disparaging way, but rather it's a tall order to try to emulate someone like the Francis of Assisi. So in a nutshell, Francis, that is of Assisi, aimed to replicate Christ in carrying out his mission. And to that end, Francis of Assisi took 3 unbreakable vows: poverty, chastity or celibacy, and obedience, rooted in the authority of the Catholic Church. The poverty vow, though, lay at the heart of his daily commitments, as it were, his earthly commitments. Neither he nor his followers could own anything, basically to avoid the worldly temptations to accumulate resources. And as a result, they'd be totally dependent upon God, and again, in their view, who would then provide anything and everything needed to survive. And poverty basically reinforced spiritual discipline as well, allowing one to focus on God at all times in terms of one's actions. There's an almost zero-sum game implied here, too, if you think about it. The less time you have to spend acquiring or worrying about possessions, the more time you could devote to God. Without worrying about possessions, you could spend more time focusing on serving others. And since Assisi believed that nature mirrored God, all creatures, large and small, were his brothers and sisters, and not just human beings as such. So serving others meant serving not just humans, but life everywhere, since all life and all life forms were believed to be part of God's creation. So I think this will be forever the greatest challenge, then, that we face as human beings in terms of the purpose and the meaning of our lives and how to live our lives, the best version, whatever that might look like. We're always going to be faced with this challenge of our attachments, especially attachments to the material conditions, and the justifications then that we use to rationalize why we need or even think we deserve what we have. And this can stir up tremendous anger and resentment, especially among people who don't agree with our positions, or who, if you start talking about things like, well, who owns what lands anyway, historically or culturally, or why are properties and holdings and money, why are these in fact ours, and why are they so important in running our lives? So most people these days conceive of individual rights and property rights as essential facets of any advanced civil society. We take them for granted. Almost no one these days of any faith or cultural background argues that people should not be allowed to own property or accumulate income and wealth. If you don't agree with that, you are definitely a radical. And in the extreme, that's what essentially Francis of Assisi was promoting, rightly or wrongly, from your perspective. And that's partly, I think, why Pope Francis was revered by so many, and yet at the same time disparaged by those who did not share his ultimate belief in an interpretation of Christ's message of serving the poor. Yes, people can debate and dispute his or the Catholic Church's political positions, whether you're talking about certain kinds of Catholic doctrine, like allowing divorced Catholics to receive communion. That's, believe it or not, that's a contentious thing within the Catholic Church. By the way, that's also why my own parents separated in 1978. I say they divorced, but they never actually divorced, even though my father lived another 10 years after that. And the reason that they didn't divorce was because they were both Catholics. And as such, the Catholic Church opposed divorce, and they didn't want to be denied communion, etc. Anyway, that's just a tiny little footnote in all of that. But again, there are other things that people can debate and have disputed with Pope Francis and with the Catholic Church in general, right? So his stances, for example, with respect to gay rights could be controversial. His stances with respect to climate change. His comments about apologizing for the role that the Catholic Church played in creating the residential school system here that was imposed upon the Indigenous peoples of Canada. And so while his message was one of apology, and he was quite direct and sorry in that regard, some on the other side have said, well, he didn't go far enough. That is to say that in terms of his the church is taking responsibility as such, and he didn't use the term cultural genocide to describe what the church had done. So again, there's always going to be differences of opinion, political debates and disputes about these sorts of things. Okay. And again, he talked about and decried the sexual abuse that has occurred within the Catholic Church, and to some degree, of course, is still occurring. So there's plenty of people then who have real problems with the Catholic Church, real problems with Pope Francis and his interpretations of the doctrines, and so on. That I don't expect will ever change. But here's the key point I want to make today. What do you say to someone who deeply believes in the vow of poverty and of Christ's ultimate teachings about the blessedness of the poor, for example? How do you argue with that one? Now, sure, don't misunderstand me. People are smart. People have figured out all kinds of justifications, but they almost always involve these almost Olympic-level mental gymnastics to avoid the obvious hypocrisy that's often embedded in their various justifications. So usually then people come up with all kinds of humanly created standards to judge people's behaviors as more or less deserving of their rewards, their money, their homes, and so forth. And most, of course, don't even have to really think about these things because we just naturally assume we're entitled to what we have, and especially if we follow the rules of society and we're good citizens. We take all that for granted, most of us. But what if you're advocating relentlessly then for the poor? For sharing our resources wherever possible, and for helping those who are vulnerable or marginalized. It's the most fundamental aspect of the Christian faith. See, now not everyone agrees that that is at the core. We say, well, no, it's belief in Christ and so forth. Maybe there's spiritual implications. But I'm talking about in terms of what are the prescriptions and proscriptions. How are we supposed to lead a life that follows the wisdom, right, and of what Christ implored, Christ's teachings? Again, there's going to be different interpretations, different emphases. I get all of that. But my point is that if you do believe in this message of helping the least among us, etc. So again, take whatever Bible verse or whatever, narratives, whatever parables you like, and you'll find there's some degree or some level at which we're supposed to be looking after each other, or looking after the quote unquote the least among us. And my question has always been, well, and even since I was a kid, I didn't know the terms, but I was always trying to figure out then, well, how do we square this then with our own lives? And especially in this world that we live in these days, how do we square this notion of helping the most vulnerable and the most marginal with living in a world of global capitalism? And no matter what country you live in these days, you are part of a global advanced capitalist system. If you're watching this vlog, it's the byproduct of technology and energy and organization and production that allows us to communicate in this fashion. So we're all part of this global economic system. And yet, what did Pope Francis do, both in terms of his actions and his words? Well, at every opportunity, he walked the walk and talked the talk. He did both. He routinely interacted with the poor and the homeless. He engaged with migrants or the displaced. He visited people in prison, and much more. He conducted an annual ritual on Holy Thursday where he'd wash the feet of others, no matter who they were, no matter what their background, as an expression of humility. And one Holy Thursday, he did exclusively wash the feet of women, again from many different backgrounds. He shunned most of the luxuries and the pomp and much of the pomp and circumstance associated with his lofty title as Pope. And instead, he'd do things like organize the World Day of the Poor each November. On the first World Day of the Poor, which was held on November 19th, 2017, the theme was, quote, "Let us love, not with words, but with deeds," end quote. And indeed, in his message for that first World Day of the Poor, Pope Francis claimed that, quote, "The Our Father is the prayer of the poor," end quote. He held a special Mass in St. Peter's Basilica, followed with free lunches across various Vatican venues. And during the week that was preceding the World Day of the Poor, they made sure that free medical services were offered at a mobile clinic. And so, if interested, again, this is now happening every November. And this year, it's going to be held on Sunday, November 16th, 2025. And so, the daily examples of his life's actions and initiatives continually revealed and reminded us of Pope Francis's humility and his commitment to serving the poor. And in parallel, Pope Francis has constantly used his papal speeches and writings to draw further attention to the plight of the poor and the vulnerable. And what would land him in the greatest trouble or generate the most political backlash of all? When he'd use his voice to speak out against the injustices he perceived in the world and those that disproportionately would affect marginalized groups, such as inequality, poverty, and conflict. And equally contentious was his constant urging that the Catholic Church and governments everywhere, other institutions, should prioritize the needs of the poor and work towards solving systemic problems. And trust me, whenever you start talking about systemic problems and change, you're going to run into a lot of resistance. That immediately starts to annoy a lot of people, especially those who've done quite well within the existing system, or at least hope to do well in the future. And that's probably most people. And yet Pope Francis held a very different view. He advocated that we should recognize the inherent dignity of every human being, but especially the poor and the marginalized. He stressed the Catholic Church's teachings on social justice, born of the ultimate Christian tradition to advocate for policies and practices that promote equality and reducing poverty. He believed in compassion to his very core. And so is that what we're really all about? Is that what the modern world looks like these days? Is that what we're looking for in our leadership? Are these the signs of true strength? Probably not for most people. My father used to love this old quote, often incorrectly attributed to Churchill. He used to say this to me. He said, "If you're not a liberal when you're young, you have no heart. And if you're not a conservative when you're old, you have no brains." And so I've often wondered about that, or at what point in our lives then do we or should we be giving up our hearts or shifting from our hearts primarily to the servicing of our brains, or using our brains as our primary determinant of our actions, and so on. So in other words, my brain understands philosophy, both liberalism, conservatism, different schools of philosophical thought. My brain has allowed me to read over 10,000 books in my lifetime, and countless more articles, academic and otherwise. So I've spent a lot of time using my brain to try to understand different facets of human knowledge and existence. My brain allows me then to understand that we live in a world in which we are one species amongst many, and we're in some kind of competition for survival. My brain understands the importance of physical fitness and strength, and the need to protect oneself from the possible threats of other human beings or other aspects of nature. My brain understands that we have only so many years to live on this planet in our current form. And my brain understands that we can fashion almost any reasonable justification for almost any course of action. And then finally, my brain can and does often tell me or tell us how to feel about what I see in this world. So the brain's pretty good. It's pretty important. Okay? But until we download our brains into computers and divorce them completely from our bodies, I cannot just dispose of my heart either. And the heart knows too, in uniquely human and important ways, about the world and nature, about kindness and suffering, and so much more. And so, for example, my brain tells me, "Joe, just go enjoy that ice cap you've been craving. It's my money. I've worked hard. I haven't been hurting anyone. I like ice caps. And heck, I deserve to get an ice cap once in a while if that's what I really want. No problem." And yet my heart tells me, when I see someone else who's suffering, they probably need that $3 more than I do. So why not help them out if I have the chance? Well, my brain says, "Well, yeah, Mikowski, you'd only have so much money. You can't just give away $3 to everybody you see. Quickly, your money will run out." My heart says, "Yeah, but you can help once in a while. And I'll still have a bank account and a home to return to. So on any given day, the change that I have in my pocket, why not?" But it's never one or the other exclusively, is it? It's always both. We have to look after ourselves. We have to be able to look after our own needs, our own well-being, our own survival. And yet at the same time, we have to be able to look after others. And yeah, even the strongest amongst us, sometimes we need others to look after us. Thank goodness we have others, most of us, in our lives, because sometimes we really do need help, don't we? And then there are sometimes others out there who just don't seem to have anyone else to help. And then we find ourselves maybe having to step up. So it's, in my view, it's a constant dialectic. It's not just when you're young, you should have a heart, and when you're old, you should have a brain. It's It's always a constant dialectic between our brains and our hearts, balancing what we need to survive and thrive, while also figuring out the best ways that we can relate to others and help serve their needs too. And who are we to help, or what responsibility do we have, especially if there are others around to do the helping? That's always a question that we should be considering. Again, let me make this very concrete. Consider the case of Anna Bielli. Her mother, Karen Fermil, had taken her and her other two siblings, so the three of them were aged 7, 6, and 3, to a sandy area along the Thames River here in London, Ontario. They'd been out at the ball field earlier. They were hot. She wanted to have give her kids a chance just to dangle their feet in the water, cool off a little bit, have a little bit of fun on a hot summer day. But when it was time to go, she briefly turned her back on the children. And then, to her horror, she realized that Anna had fallen into the water. Now, unfortunately, the mother, Karen, couldn't swim. And so she desperately, of course, wanted to try to, get her daughter before she was swept away by the currents. And so she tried to reach her daughter. She did whatever she could in that particular moment. And of course, she was yelling for help, hoping there might be somebody else around. And she called 911. So she did all the right things that she could under those immediate circumstances. But unfortunately and tragically, Anna's mother couldn't save her. And she was indeed swept away and found a few days later, 3 kilometers downstream from where she'd fallen in. So yeah, all of this just happened last August. I remember it quite well. And I know if I'd been there, of course I wasn't, and there wasn't anybody else. There weren't any other families immediately in the vicinity where they were. I know that if I'd been there, I guarantee I wouldn't have hesitated to dive into the water where she'd fallen. I would have definitely jumped into that river, and I would have tried to save Anna. Okay? I'm a strong swimmer, courtesy of Patsy and Joseph Mikalski, who made us all go to swimming practice before and after school for years. So I can swim. I can still swim quite strongly. So I would have been in that river. My heart would have told me, save that little girl. There's no doubt in my mind that I would have tried. Even if my brain had been saying, well, Joe, that's a pretty strong current, though. The storm waters and so forth. And I bet that if you were there and you knew how to swim, you'd almost certainly have jumped in that river as well. And that's essentially what I learned yet again, or was reminded yet again, or time and time again on a regular basis by Pope Francis. Jump in the river, if you can, and paddle furiously. Use your resources however you can to help save that child. Regardless of whether she's your own child or that of a total stranger. And guess what? That requires using both our heads to think and our hearts to feel. We want to figure out how to save that child because she's worth saving. And even if you couldn't swim, would you not at least try to help save the child? Wouldn't you use your smarts and do whatever you could with your resources, with your abilities, to figure out a solution to the problem? Of course you would, at least if you have a heart. So again, we need both. And this is the tricky thing. You see, unless you're able to use your brains, your smarts, to come up with reasons for why it's not your responsibility. Okay? And that's much easier to do when we don't actually see what's going on, right? Or we see the child fall into the river, and we don't know what's happening, or we don't see what's going on, or we're not immediately there to be able to intervene. Or sometimes if we can just ignore situations where we didn't have anything to do with it in the first place. Indeed, that was, by the way, my first reaction. Of course, I was sorry. Who wouldn't be? About the loss of Anna. But I genuinely wasn't there, and I didn't know what happened until days later. So, of course, there was nothing that I could do, and that's all true. What Pope Francis was asking, though, was that we use our brains to learn about the Annas of the world, to become aware of people's vulnerability and their poverty, beyond the immediacy of our day-to-day lives, too. So could we then learn about other people, their poverty, their marginalization, their struggles? And then once we became aware, what would we do? What could we do? How might we use our brains to try to help people in difficult situations, or engage opposing sides in a dispute to help them resolve a conflict, or rethink how we might live our lives to reduce threats to the environment, and so on. So the alternative is either to not use our brains to think about such things. When we say ignorance is bliss, that's essentially what we're doing. Right? We can just get on with our days and our lives without worrying. And we all do that to a degree, right? And myself included. To me, it's just yet again a reminder that we should continue to engage both our heads and our hearts to figure out our best pathways forward in life, but at the same time, while we're trying to be aware of people and the world around us. We have to try and strike kind of a healthy balance, if you will. So here's a simple example of what I'm talking about. So I'm crossing the street at a traffic light on my way to wherever, and I'm enjoying some music with my earbuds, and I'm focusing my attention on safely getting across the street to the other side. But at the same time, I balance that awareness with my surroundings. I don't foolishly step right in front of a car that I can see is clearly not going to stop. More commonly, I'll often see as I'm walking through that crosswalk, I'll see that there are other cars waiting to turn. I don't ignore them, selfishly, locked in my own little world. Instead, if I see cars that are turning, I speed up a little bit. Just being aware, not just of my own needs, but of their needs. And I'm hoping that basically I'll help them get on their ways a little bit more quickly too. Or perhaps I smile and wave, give them some positive energy. Or I nod and I wave them ahead. Because I just see, that makes sense. They're there, they're ready to turn. I've still got 4 or 5 more steps before I get there. So maybe, hey, go ahead. That is actually literally what happened to me yesterday. And the person in the car smiled and waved back. We communicated with each other. We helped each other out. They got there more quickly. I crossed safely. No problem. Okay? And so basically that's the message that I take from Pope Francis. It lies at the core of my being and my understanding of the purpose and meaning of life. We're only human, but we can try not to be selfish a-holes, or as best we can. That's kind of a negative way of putting it. Stated more positively, to me, the real message is that we should always be using our brains and our hearts, and not in some mutually exclusive fashion, but rather, not only do we use them so that we can personally survive and ideally thrive, but at the same time, we should be using our brains and our hearts in the service of others. We can always learn more, too, and become more aware. And again, try to balance our energy needs. And we can figure out then how to work more effectively, not only to help ourselves live a good life and a proper life, but we can also try to figure out how to work with others and honor all of God's creation. Again, however we conceive of that. And so that's our challenge. All right. Until next time, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives, nurture love in your hearts, and dole out hugs in abundance. and we'll see you soon.